Hi, this is Greg Thomas, and welcome to the Welsh American channel. Today, our guest is Trevor Taylor, who has been on this channel before. In October of 2023, my wife BJ and I had the tremendous privilege and honor of spending a few days in North Wales, and our guide at the time was Trevor. He's the proprietor of Tudno Tours. Trevor is very knowledgeable about North Wales and was head of geography at Llandudno Secondary School for 27 years. If you're traveling in the future to North Wales, the beautiful land of Cymru, please, I encourage you to contact Trevor for an exceptional touring experience. In the comments section below, I'll be leaving complete contact information for Trevor. He comes very highly recommended. Well, Trevor, welcome to the Welsh American channel.
Hello, Greg. Good to speak to you again. Looking forward to
It's great. It's great to see you again. It's been a few months. Trevor has become our resident travel advisor and our historian on this channel. And today we have a special episode on a Welshman whom every American should know about, especially if you are an American of Welsh heritage. David Lloyd George achieved many things during his long political career. For example, his organizational skills and his strategic priorities helped Britain to win the First World War after it struggled after the start of the war. So in today's broadcast or podcast, we're going to be talking about this man. Lloyd George never visited the United States. He had remarkable gifts and talents and abilities. He actually was planning on visiting, but he was uninvited by President Wilson due to a lot of political tensions that were caused by differences in their strategies for World War I. So today we're going to talk about this remarkable man and some of his achievements and maybe some of the challenges he had as an individual as well. So Trevor, are we ready?
Ready and raring to go whenever you are.
Okay. Well, Trevor, Americans are accustomed to hearing about and living rags to riches stories where individuals of very humble and simple birth rise out of poverty or obscurity and attain positions of great power or influence. And I know this wasn't common 150 years ago, about the time that Lloyd George would have been born, because of Britain's rigid class structure. So tell us about the circumstances of his birth and his early childhood.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about where he finished up and from where he started, it is quite amazing. If you look at all of the prime ministers of the UK before him, for the 100 years before him, every one of them was, their father was Earl or a Marquis, very, very high up in the regnal system, or they were from very wealthy families. William Gladstone, who was a prime minister for quite a lot of the Victorian era, his family were huge slave owners in Jamaica and Guyana. They owned thousands of slaves and made lots of money. Disraeli was the only closest person who was a commoner who made it to the top job. But even Disraeli came from a wealthy family. His family were traders. But Lloyd George was born. He was actually born in Manchester. So for the greatest Welshman that ever lived, he was actually born in Manchester. His father was a teacher, and his father was unwell. Had lots of pneumonia and had lots of chest diseases. So his father actually, almost as soon as Lloyd George was born, they moved down to Pembrokeshire, which is where he'd originally come from. But sadly, he died when Lloyd George was just an infant. So there was his mother. She had Lloyd George. He had an elder brother, himself, and there was a baby on the way. His sister was on the way. So there was his mother, a single woman, with her husband dead, and 3 children to look after. So what she did is she went back home. She went back to a place called Llanystumdwy. Hopefully you can put a map of its location when you're editing this. She went back there because that's the place of her birth, and she went to live with her brother. And it was her brother Richard who was the major influence on Lloyd George's life. He was a cobbler, a shoemaker. And so working in this small village as a shoemaker, but he was also a lay preacher and a very strong liberal. So at the time we had basically 2 political groups. We had the Tories and the Liberals. The Liberals were free trade people. The Tories were very much the part of representing the landowning class. And so the battle between those two, and his uncle Richard was a very, very proud liberal, a very strong liberal. And sort of stories have it from the time that there used to be lots of debates in the back room of his shoe shop. And young Lloyd George, young David would sit there and soak it all up. And he, obviously, his father being a lay preacher, was obviously he was dragged from chapel to chapel. And it says that Lloyd George actually lost his religion fairly early on, but he still these because he loved to hear people talk. At the time, the preachers at the time, the Baptist preachers in North Wales, they were the pop stars. They were the Taylor Swifts of the year of the age. And if someone well known was coming to a chapel, they'd be queuing outside the door to hear them. So there was a saying. It said he was a connoisseur of the preachers. You know, he wanted to hear these preaching, and of course that probably started to formulate his ideas. And get him into the world of politics later on, even though religion and politics could be separate. This idea of through things and being passionate and speaking, and a lot of his speeches later on, people said it was almost like he was preaching to us, because of course that's where he brought it up from. So so he's the only Welsh speaker ever to be our Prime Minister. He was the first commoner to be a prime minister, and I say in those times it was just unheard of, not just to be prime minister, but to be anywhere near the top job for someone with a background like that, someone who was born almost orphaned. When he was a young baby, his father died. It's quite a remarkable story for a man, and obviously highlights his determination and obviously the nature of his abilities, which we'll probably come on to later on.
Yeah, I've heard the term Welsh hoyle, which is a term used to describe a kind of charismatic, energetic speaking that Welsh are known for, particularly Welsh preachers. So apparently he had that in the political side, having grown up and heard it in the churches, the chapels. Absolutely. He carried that over into the political
fire and brimstone. You can imagine him getting up and speaking. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So how and why did he decide to get into politics?
It's probably from his character. He was a very ambitious man. In fact, when he proposed to his wife, I've got a quote. I have to read it because I can't get it.
Okay, sure. Please do.
Warned his wife, Margaret, when he proposed to her. He said, "My supreme idea is to get on. To this idea, I shall sacrifice everything except I trust honesty. I'm prepared to thrust even love itself under the wheels of my juggernaut if it obstructs the way." So he very early on, he was very determined to get on, to make something of his life, and to prove to people what he could do. He was known when he was later on in London. He was known as the outsider. He didn't mix with the sort of crowd that everyone else was mixing with. A lot of the politicians at the time would go to their gentlemen's clubs and sit there drinking gin and tonic all day. Not Lloyd George. He kept to his true beliefs, and he was very passionate about what he wanted to do, and he genuinely did want to make the life of the common person that much better. He saw how his mother struggled during his childhood, and wanted to stop that later on. In fact, my wife's granny was a massive supporter of Lloyd George, would have a word said against Lloyd George, and she said, "It's because of him I got my pension." And she really show that he wanted to actually help the people, and he also was a great protagonist of Wales as well. He saw a lot of problems in Wales, and he saw that we weren't being treated fairly, and wanted to do something about it. So, with a man with that much power and that much ambition and that much energy, politics was the obvious route for him to take.
Well, I guess it was a way for him to have the greatest influence on promoting Wales and helping Wales with some of the challenges that people were experiencing. We know politics is about power, and power has the ability to create change.
It can, absolutely.
It would have been natural for him, I guess, to be attracted to that. So as he entered adulthood, what did he choose as a career? And the reason I asked that question is I know from history that at that time, the backbenchers, or those who didn't have government offices, didn't receive a salary in Parliament at the time. So it basically locked out poor or middle-class Britons because they didn't have the money to be in Parliament and eat at
He
the
needed money to
same
get in
time.
and
So
to
it was a
live.
real handicap.
Absolutely. So his uncle Richard was a very much
Mhm.
pushing him into better things. It was said at the time that a Welsh family wanted their child to be either a preacher, a teacher, or a solicitor. One of the three.
Ah, okay.
And his uncle Richard pushed him into law. Again, young David was a great debater. He was passionate about things, and he would argue points. So that was an obvious route for him to take. So his uncle got him an apprenticeship at the age of 16 with
Hmm.
a firm of solicitors in Porthmadog. And down young David went and started off just doing very basic work, but then he took his legal exams and he passed with honours, passed with the highest grade in that year. And immediately, again, a sign of his ambition, he broke away from the solicitors that he'd been working with since 16. This is as a young man now in his early 20s,
Ah,
and set
okay.
up his own practice. Went back to his uncle, so went back to the shoe shop, and that's where he'd practiced his law from. And he came to prominence quite early on. It was a case called the Llanrothen case. At the time, if you
Mhm.
were a Methodist or any sort of non-conformist, you couldn't have a burial ceremony or be buried in the parish grounds. That was dominated by what was called the Church of England at the time, which is another thing he railed against throughout his life. So that was a real wrong. That's a law had come in to put that right, to say that no, anyone can go to consecrated ground and anyone can have the ceremony. But a local priest in North Wales locked out a group of Methodists when they wanted to bury one of their dead, and they broke in and they were arrested. So young Lloyd George took up the case and got it. It became in part of the national news. He
Mhm.
won this case for these people, that they had the right to a proper funeral. So Lloyd George won the case, so allowed
Mhm.
people to make sure that people could have a proper funeral and be buried in consecrated ground. And that brought him prominence within the local area, and that got him into politics at the very first point. So he got himself to be made. He was an MP. Again, to make it to MP stage, as you were saying, in terms of the money, that was almost unheard of for
Mhm.
a normal person, because there was no wage. So his brother William actually supported him, because his brother William came in and joined him in his legal practice. So the two of them, it was the Lloyd George brothers. It was a legal practice. So William carried on practicing law and actually later became a JP in Carnarvonshire. So it was quite high up within the legal system within Carnarvonshire. But he kept the family business going, and that helped to pay for Lloyd George's political career. So he didn't have any massive sponsors. He didn't have a
Mhm.
rich sugar daddy who was giving him money. He basically raised that money from himself and from his supporters in order to make it into Parliament in the first place. But he still had to earn and work a living. So even when he became an MP, he carried on practicing law. So he set up a branch of his legal firm in London. So he'd be an MP for maybe 3 or 4 days a week, and then the rest of the time he'd be practicing law. And that was paying for him just to stay alive and to live in London. Although it did say he lived quite a frugal life, particularly early on. He didn't have much money. His wife stayed at home, so she stayed in North Wales, brought up the family, and he lived as almost like a single man down in London, which is obviously that much
Mhm.
cheaper. He was just renting rooms, and it made his early career there until he started to rise through the ranks. So yeah, quite a remarkable rise for a normal person, and a very unusual thing to happen at that time.
Sure. You remind me, you may be aware of this, but some of the earliest colonists in North America, British North America,
Mm-hmm.
were Welsh,
Yep.
and they were Welsh Quakers who, for the very reason you were explaining about the issue of being buried
Yep.
and having the respect even upon your deceased members, those are some of the very reasons that so many Welsh Quakers came to the United States, encouraged by William Penn, and
Yep.
settled west of Philadelphia in what was originally known as the Welsh Tract. And then there
Yep.
was another group that settled up, I believe they were Baptists, that settled up in today what is Swansea, Massachusetts. And they also,
Okay.
being Baptists, were dissenters and had left Britain because of the persecution and because of some of the very things that you discussed. And
Yep.
here they are going on 200-300 years later, and
Still
Lloyd
there.
George has to confront the issue. It's still there.
Absolutely. In fact, the Welsh settlers in Patagonia, obviously there's a Welsh community in Patagonia in Argentina, exactly the same thing. It was religious. They wanted to carry on their religious beliefs and they felt they were being persecuted and weren't getting the chance. Yep. So it carried on, yes, all the way through. The non-conformists always were, that by their nature, they were non-conformists, that they weren't society. They weren't accepted in society as much. Yeah. So they had to fight for their religion.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Or go somewhere else where
Yeah.
they felt they could be free.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
So he progresses through Parliament. He enters Parliament. He progresses through Parliament. He, if you look historically, he rose steadily. He has a number of positions in Parliament. He's president of the Board of Trade.
Yep.
He's Chancellor of the Exchequer. Then he's the Minister of Munitions.
Yep.
Then the war starts, World War I. He's Secretary for War. So what actual events led up to him becoming Prime Minister during World War I?
Yeah, and that shows how great his ability was, that he could rise. That Chancellor Exchequer still today is seen as the number 2 job in the country. Very much the person with a hand on the purse, and he did such great things as the Chancellor of Exchequer. I was saying about my wife's granny. That's when he started to introduce the ideas of pensions and looking after the poorer people. And he became a really popular figure because he had come from the bottom. He understood what the working class person wanted. He understood what they wanted to hear, and then his skill of as an orator allowed him to enunciate this. So a lot of MPs, because they were brought up with it, it was almost like part of the family job that they went into. They weren't that good at it, and they certainly weren't good at speaking to the common person. So Lloyd George was an extremely popular person with the general public, and his energy and his enthusiasm made him into a real rising star of the party. So he did great things as a Chancellor of the Exchequer. He delivered a budget which is the most radical budget that's ever been performed, and he took on authority. He took on the privileged classes. Because for the first time, and we've had something very similar to it in the UK this year. He had taxes for landowners. He called it a land tax. And of course, the ruling classes, the landowning classes, they railed against this, that they should have to pay taxes for the land and the wealth they had. And they actually voted down his budget. In the House of Lords, it was thrown out of the House of Lords. So he went on the rampage rather than accepting it and saying, "Okay, well, these people are my betters. I better not rile them anymore." He actually did the opposite, and he gave a speech called the Limehouse speech. And still today, an annual speech is given by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in a place called Limehouse. It's in the East End of London, because that's where Lloyd George went to. And basically, he spoke to a group of common people. It was the East End. I mean, it was the rough end of London. He didn't go to a club. He didn't stand up in the House of Commons. He went into this rough part of London and stood up and basically railed against the fact that people wouldn't let him do good for the normal person. And particularly, the reason it was thrown out by the House of Lords. Now, you've got different legislative groups. We've got the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the House of Commons are voted for, but the House of Lords, it's peerages, it's hereditary peerages. And he, as part of his speech, he said, "Why should 500 men chosen by accident of birth be allowed to stop me helping people?" I paraphrase his there, but it's something like that. Yeah, and it really was. Oh, okay. This man is actually taking us on.
Sure.
Because of that, the laws were changed, and now the House of Lords in the UK has no real power. They can't do that again. They can't vote down a budget because the voted for MPs, if they want a law to go in, it goes to the House of Lords to be viewed, and they can review it and they can ask for changes to be made. They say, "Well, we don't think you should be doing this." So they act almost like a bit of a break on the House of Commons. But at the end of the day, the House of Commons always gets its way. And that's because Lloyd George took them on and fought through these reforms, his new budget. So I'd say he was a really popular character. And when the war started, Asquith was the Prime Minister, and Asquith, as a man, was a very, very, very knowledgeable man, very scholarly man. but not a great communicator. He was,
Mm.
and he wasn't a great organizer either. So there was disgruntlement about Asquith being the leader. But then, as part of the early part of the war, we had a really split political system. That he needed the votes. He needed to go into coalition with the Conservatives. So the two main political parties had to come together, because, I mean, again, it happens in several states where we don't get an overall majority. So he had to go into coalition with them, but the Tories didn't like Asquith because they saw him as a ditherer,
Okay.
and they
Mm.
liked Lloyd George. So Lloyd George was basically the one who they thought, well, we'd support him, but we won't support Asquith. And Lloyd George possibly precipitated this, because he moved and wanted to make certain changes into the way in which he was running. But you said he was in charge of Minister of Munitions. He wanted to make it his own group that was just under his power and didn't have to answer to Asquith. And Asquith said, no, I'm the Prime Minister. I'm in charge. You'll only do what I tell you. And that caused problems. And eventually Asquith resigned. His position was no longer tenable. Here's his number two man, who should be his supporter, actually going against him, and, if you like, siding with the opposition. And when we come to his ending later on, when you ask me about how his career ended, that's where that was the start of his problem. He split his own party, he split the Liberal parties, because Asquith resigned, but also several of the other Liberal ministers resigned because they supported Asquith still. They saw this young upstart from Wales as coming in and pushing out their man. So he split his own party, but that brought him to power in the first place. And then he completely, radically changed the way in which the government was run. Up until then, it was a very open system. There was a cabinet. There was 30, 40 people sat in a room. Things happened very, very slowly, and there were things that needed to be done weren't done because maybe one person went against it. Well, Lloyd George says, look, we're in a war. We're in a crisis situation. So he made himself his own little war cabinet. And they weren't politicians, they weren't MPs he brought on. He had a group of 5 people with him, a couple of Welsh people, a couple of Welsh businessmen, Waldorf Astor, the American millionaire. He joined this group as well. He had a professor. Yeah. So he basically picked people who he thought were the people who knew business, people who knew money, people who would get things done, and then, as I say, a professor of war as well to get a lot of the fighting and right, what is needed, how do you win wars. And he basically just talked to them, made decisions, and went to Parliament and said, right, we are doing this. And that had never happened before. I say it was a radical change, made him very unpopular with many people who saw that he was taking charge and being very much everything centered around Lloyd George. But it was needed. During a time of war, you need quick decisions. You don't have to be worried about offending someone. You have to say, no, this is in the best interest of the country, and that's what he did. And he ran the country very, very well. He was, as I say, he's an extremely intelligent man. He would insist, when people came to him, he'd insist that they got straight to the point. He hated people coming and waffling and giving him all the background. Look, what do you need? What's the problem? How can I solve it for you? And that's what he did. So he ran the country so efficiently that obviously the history of World War I, we had the countries basically, we fought ourselves to a standstill. The poor soldiers dying there in the trenches. Not very good warfare. And it was just a case of which country bankrupted itself first. And the Germans ran out of money, and the Germans ran out of money and men first, because Lloyd George was running the country better than Germany was being run. So although he never shot anyone, you could see Lloyd George and the way in which he organized things was the big difference, and helped us to win the First World War.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Yeah,
you mentioned earlier about I wanted to make a comment about the people's budget. He was the first one to introduce what we would call today the welfare state.
Welfare state.
I'm not sure that's a fair term, but he's considered the father of the welfare state. And it wasn't until a few decades later that Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, basically copied some of the ideas that he had. The Americans have Social Security, which is our version of the old age, which you would call an old age pension, in Britain. And then we have the Medicare program, which is a health care that provide at least some coverage for seniors, a health care program. All of those, and all of those were introduced by Franklin Roosevelt. And he did something else that copied Lloyd George, and that is he began to increase taxes and have taxes where taxes had never been had before.
Yes.
To the point, I think, and I think that's been copied in much of what Lloyd George started there has been copied, I believe, in most of Western civilization. I'll give you an example. In the United States today, the upper 1% in the United States pay 65% of all taxes.
Wow.
Yeah. And that is what supports the social programs and military spending and all the things that the United States gets involved in. And the one who introduced that idea or that concept of putting an additional burden on the wealthy was Lloyd George himself.
Lloyd George, because of where he came from, because he wasn't part of the wealthy. He wasn't, he wasn't attacking his own people. He was the outsider coming in and a breath of fresh air. Yes, absolutely.
So aside from what you just mentioned, were there any other things that he did differently as a war leader during World War I to change things? You mentioned he was a better organizer. You mentioned that he kind of cut down some of the layers of bureaucracy and got down to anything else that you can think of.
In terms of the military part of it, he didn't get on with many of the military leaders at the time because, again, they were the old boys club, and they were just like the Russians still do, just throwing men at the front and again, it was who was being thrown at the front, the common working man, the sort of man that George really felt for. And he wants to stop that. So he had massive rows with Haig. He had massive rows with all of the senior leadership. And he actually tried to bring in a French general to lead the British Army. Which you can imagine how that went down.
I could think of some good one-liners there, but I'm going to resist.
Yeah, absolutely. He wanted to professionalize the British Army, and he wanted to make sure that every life lost was lost in a very hard way rather than just thrown at people. So he hated the idea of trench warfare. He didn't want to take the Battle of the Somme. He was opposed to that idea and the Marne, which ended up obviously being complete catastrophes. Hundreds of thousands of men dying to make 3 meters of land. And he saw his role was just to keep Britain afloat. And I say he managed to do it long enough to actually help us to survive, partly by borrowing money from abroad, particularly from the States. And you mentioned he did have rows with Woodrow. He wanted more from America than he was being given. And they felt they were being almost like milked, a cow there to be milked. But he saw that was more important than throwing men into battle. Actually, getting the structure right behind her, and that's what he focused on.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, of course, that in time Germany went bankrupt first.
Yep.
And surrendered. And that was followed by the Paris Peace Conference, I think in 1919 and 1920.
Yeah.
The Paris Peace Conference occurred. And Lloyd George clashed with the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. And also President Wilson, whom we've mentioned a little bit earlier. Well, so what was important to Lloyd George that caused some of the shall we say, disagreements during the Paris Peace Conference?
Brilliant quote. He said, I was seated between Jesus and Bonaparte. In other words, Woodrow Wilson didn't want any sort of reparations. He wanted to be very kind to Germany. He said, look, the country is bankrupt. People are going to suffer. If you add to the suffering, then you're going to cause problems in future. And obviously he was proved right, and obviously with later on. Whereas Clemenceau and the French, because they've been on the front line of it, they wanted to squeeze every German mark that was left out of Germany. They wanted land from Germany. They wanted reparation. They wanted so Lloyd George was very much the man in the middle, trying to balance out one person and another one. And
Right.
to be fair to him, he actually managed to get them together and managed to come to an agreement that allowed France to feel like it was getting some money back, to get also some money back for the UK, but not completely destroy Germany, and make sure that there was a chance for the state to improve and carry on within the future. So again, it's another one of his, right, what do we need? What? Let's get to the heart of the problem. What do we need to do here? And he managed to get people on side, and the fact that a treaty was signed in the end is probably thanks to Lloyd George being that man in the middle, getting the Americans and the French to actually concede and come somewhere central to make it better. Yeah, so he was very much a man who was. They said he was a born actor. You know, he'd speak to different people in different ways. In some ways, it was a bit of a flaw of him. He wasn't trustworthy. He would go behind. He would say one thing to one person and something else to another person, knowingly, but knew that certain people wanted to hear certain things. But he managed to get the job done, and he managed to get this agreement and the Treaty of Versailles signed. It wasn't perfect by any means, but at least there was an agreement, and there was a way forward for Europe in the future. Didn't last, but at least he gave it a chance. Gave it his chance. Yeah.
Sure. So he was a great mediator.
Yeah.
You said he was an actor. You remind me of a statement by Richard Burton, who once said that all the Welsh are actors. It's only the mediocre ones who get into the actual profession.
There we are. And again, you can see that from the Baptist background. I mean, they're actors. Some of those religious leaders early on with spitting the fire and brimstone. That's all a huge act. You know, massive performance that would really entrance the people there and get them to do as they wanted. Yeah, so he was very much part of that background. In fact, they called Downing Street Little Wales. Because he surrounded himself with Welsh people, and he also stayed with. There is a Welsh community, well, still is in London, but Welsh expats, and he stayed with them. He would go to see male voice choirs. That would be part of his entertainment.
Okay.
Not going to the opera with Lord this and Lady that.
Right, sure.
He'd love to see a Welsh choir perform, or he'd go to a Baptist church and just listen to a speaker speaking. You know, that's what he wanted. He had singers come in and actually sing in Downing Street. You know, and lots of Welsh was spoken in Downing Street as well. So yeah, it was a. That's part of his personality. He always stayed very much truly a Welshman at heart and a non-conformist at heart as well. Yeah.
So he was prime minister, I think, from 1916 to 1922.
Yep.
But then eventually, as all politicians and as all leaders, the time comes when you're out of power. So what happened that he lost his position of power as prime minister?
Yeah, I mean, there were several things aligned to cause problems. He had problems with women. There's some very documented problems, personal problems with women, but also with the suffragette movement, which was very strong at the time. Originally, Lloyd George was in favour of the suffragettes and was in favour of women, but a group of them actually set a bomb off in his summer residence.
Oh my!
And so he called them terrorists. He said, "Well, look, I'm not giving in to terrorists." So he was fighting that problem. He had a series of foreign policy mishaps that obviously at the end of the war there was lots of vacuums of power. So lots of little disputes were going on there, and Lloyd George got involved in a couple of them. There was one in particularly in Turkey, and there was no appetite for this within the UK. You know, we were done with war. We didn't want war. We didn't want so that caused him problems. But what really killed him off was the Ireland problem. It caused problems throughout the century before. Really, ever since Ireland was part of a real colony, it was seen as a problem that needed solving, and no one could solve it. Whereas Lloyd George can be credited that he was the one who actually did solve the Ireland problem. The Ireland that you see today is because of the agreement made by Lloyd George with the IRA, who were based in Dublin with De Valera. So he actually got them to make a decision. In fact, another little thing, part of his meeting with De Valera, they were meeting away, and he was deliberately speaking with his advisor in Welsh, because the two of them were speaking Welsh, so the De Valera couldn't understand. And De Valera raged against it. He said, "No, look, you speak there." He said, "Well, if you want to speak Gaelic, feel free to speak Gaelic." So, it was part of that, but he managed to get an agreement which no one else previously had done. But as I said to you at the start of the war, he split his own party, the Liberal Party, and he was in coalition with the Conservatives, the Tories. But they were one nation people. The subtitle of theirs are the Unionist Party. They wanted to keep Ireland as a whole. So the fact that he'd now done the deal to break off part of Ireland, even though it was the right thing, not just the fair thing to do, but also the right thing to do for the country, because it would have split us apart if we couldn't afford a fight with our nearest neighbour.
Sure.
But he lost the support of the Conservatives on one side of the coalition, and his own people, obviously, he'd lost half of those. So he literally fell through a crack of his own making, fell right through the floor, and was kicked out. And because of that, he didn't just fall and get voted out. I mean, he was basically persona non gratis. He'd sit on his own in the Commons. He had a few of his buddies, but that was really it. As we also had a Labour Party that had just formed as well, that were taking a lot of their lead from the rise of communism in Russia at the time. So there was a Workers' Party, so they were growing. The Tory Party had stayed strong, and his party he'd split in half. And one half didn't want anything to do with Lloyd George because they blamed him for the fact that their party, having been the biggest party at the start of the century, actually came fourth in the elections, which is put them right the way down below everything else. So he basically carried on being an MP. So he was the MP right the way through. And if anyone does want to come on any of my tours, particularly if people come on cruise ships to Holyhead, I take people around Carnarvon Castle, and they can stand underneath the statue of Lloyd George there, because he was the MP for Carnarvonshire right the way through to the bitter end. He was a close friend of Churchill. Churchill really respected Lloyd George, because Churchill in his earlier career had a few problems, and it was Lloyd George that brought him back into government, and Lloyd George who showed faith in a young Churchill. So Churchill actually said he was one of the greatest ever. In fact, one of my favourite quotes is, "The greatest Welshman which such incomparable race has ever produced." Was a Churchill of Lloyd George. So
that's quite a compliment.
Absolutely, the greatest ever living Welshman. So he did have some support, but he didn't have a support base. So he really was a lone voice. He brought lots of things. He tried to get lots of laws. He was still pushing for the idea of welfare, but he was doing it with no power behind him. He was just an MP on his own, fighting the cause, which is a bit of a shame for a man who'd been so great and so prominent. But there was no way back for him. He didn't have any support base. He'd lost it. Yeah.
So, as you said, he continued for a couple of decades before he died to remain in Parliament after he had, shall we say, fallen from grace, if I can use that term, as being Prime Minister. But near I probably would have been the late 1930s, I'm guessing, he became kind of enamored with Nazi Germany, and I believe even visited Hitler and had some positive things to say about the Nazis, which is one of the criticisms that his biography is mentioned in Wikipedia and some other places. I'm interested on your views and whether that's a fair criticism.
No, it was. He was convinced that Hitler was a force for good. He'd seen the mess that Germany was left in, and of course, young Hitler was very charismatic. He said he visited Germany and he saw what was being done. And whereas there were obviously the political problems on the unseemly side of Nazism, it was also trying to improve the life of the working class. That's how Hitler came in. He was the people supported him. So he thought that Hitler was a force for good, and he believed Hitler when he said, "Look, I don't want any other power. I simply want to make Germany strong again, and I'm looking after my people again." So he stood up in Parliament several times and said, "Look, you don't have to worry about Hitler. He's a good guy." which was obviously a massive political misjudgment that he made. And as you say, it's such a shame that such a powerful man who did so much for good has that little sort of taint in his character at the end because of a decision he made later on. But he was convinced that Hitler was looking after the people rather than the aristocracy of Germany, which is probably why I supported him. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the good things that Hitler did. The United States has a pretty extensive interstate system in which people can go fast. Obviously, we're from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We're a pretty wide nation.
Absolutely.
But we have a very extensive interstate network. So you can get on our interstate, and I don't know what it would be in kilometers, but you can go 70, 80 miles an hour from point A to point B. And all of that is because when General Eisenhower was marching his troops through Germany, he was deeply impressed with the Autobahn, which Hitler had developed. And when he became president, when Eisenhower became president, he financed the beginning of our interstate system because he could see the advantage of if you were ever in a war to move your supplies quickly from the east to the west because the roads were good. And so it was that inspired Eisenhower to begin our national interstate system here in the United States. So Hitler did do some remarkable things early on.
It just shows, doesn't it? I mean, and I say Lloyd George saw what Hitler was doing and saw the positive things he was doing for a country that was bankrupt, that was an enormous problem. And of course, Lloyd George was always worried about communism as well. And he saw Hitler as the perfect antidote. He was a man of the people, but he wasn't a communist. And that's one of the other reasons why he advocated support for Hitler.
Now you mentioned that he and Churchill were close, and I think they did have some similarities. Churchill went through a period of his life known as the wilderness years, where he was ostracized by many people in Parliament and in the culture who didn't want anything to do with what they perceived as that old fossil out there talking about the empire and things of that nature. So I think they shared some of that. I'm just curious if you know why Lloyd George refused to become part of Churchill's cabinet in the Second World War.
I don't know why he refused. I can imagine. I mean, he was old. He was old by that stage. I mean, he died in 1994.
Yes, he would have. Right, he would have been.
He'd have been quite old. So maybe he just didn't feel he had the capacity anymore. I genuinely don't know. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall to wonder why he did what it was, because I say they were very close. When you look at how Churchill ran the Second World War, he took a lot of his learning from the way in which Lloyd George had run the First World War. You know, in terms of having this cabal of a small group of trusted people and not quite ostracizing Parliament, but making a Parliament realise that they've got to do what's best for the country and follow him. So I mean, he followed Lloyd George's lead, but Lloyd George obviously politically, Lloyd George was different from certainly from the later Churchill. I mean, because Churchill started off as a liberal. He started off as a liberal, but in his later life he became more and more conservative. Yes, so it was probably that would he couldn't do it, or maybe it's his experience of splitting the Liberal Party early on and joining with Conservatives early on. Maybe I'm not doing that again.
You bet.
Yeah.
Well, let's review some of what we might say are some of the significant accomplishments of Lloyd George. First thing, and we've touched upon all these things, but maybe we can just extract a little bit more out of them because they are pretty significant accomplishments for a man in one political career. I guess the first thing I would mention is his role in disestablishing and disendowing the Church of England back into allowing disestablished religions to have an equal place in the Welsh
religious freedom
was
a big thing. The Church of England still is a bit of a behemoth. But at the time it was all dominant. It had far too much power, and it was spending a lot of money on itself rather than on the people. So yes, I mean, he railed against the Church of England, and he was a great believer in devolution as well. I mean, we're thinking about we've got devolution now here in Wales, but Lloyd George was thinking about this very, very early on. He formed, when he was a young man in Carnarvonshire, before he actually became an MP, he formed a newspaper called the People's Bugle, that was calling for more autonomy within Wales. So things such as there was an Education Act that gave a special Welsh type of education, so gave Welsh people actually control, the Welsh Office control over education in Wales. Several other things, the universities of Wales, he supported those, and several other Welsh establishments that hadn't happened beforehand. Lloyd George was proponent of those. So I mean, he brought that in as well. Yeah, so he certainly was. It wasn't just his wartime career that he did. He was looking on a much wider scale. In fact, probably if he was around today, he'd probably be a member of we've got a party called Plaid Cymru, the party of Wales who wants independent for Wales. I wouldn't be surprised if Lloyd George would be on their side if he was here today, because he certainly started the movement for bringing functions into the control of the Welsh people, rather than being told from London what was best for Wales.
I think the first referendum that passed in Wales for its own self-government was 1997.
Yeah.
So 50 plus years before, Lloyd George was promoting that idea of devolution of government and bringing powers back to the Welsh people.
Yeah.
So that's rather remarkable.
It is, yeah, yeah. And he actually formed a group of Welsh politicians from all parties. It was like a cross-party group to speak Wales, and that had never happened before. When you look at the list of prime ministers, none of them were Welsh. There are lots of, majority of them English, but quite a few Scottish prime ministers, a surprising amount of Scottish prime ministers, but none of them was Welsh. And he really did feel like the Welsh people didn't have a voice, and weren't, they were being treated as naughty children who should be kept in the corner. So by getting the Welsh MPs from all parties, not just his own party, to come together and speak on Welsh issues and speak as in one voice on Welsh issues, started the idea of devolution, as you say, a century before it really came into fruition itself.
Yes. Another accomplishment we could say of Lloyd George would be, again, I'm not a fan of the term the welfare state. Because I think most of us here in the 21st century appreciate having a national safety net for people who face unemployment or people who grow old. After all, you can't help but grow old.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have a pension. It's nice to have something it's government sponsored for you. I can't imagine the state that most American seniors would be in if Social Security did not exist today, because it is the primary pension that most Americans have is Social Security, which is a government pension program. And
it's just the sheer idea that wealthy people, the people with the money, have a duty to support those who don't have the money. I mean, that's something that wasn't heard of before. You know, they didn't feel they had that duty. You spend your own money. It's my money. I'm going to spend it, and I don't need to help the poor people. So it's just the idea. Even if there was no laws, even if there wasn't any physical money going out as a welfare state, the idea that the rich have a duty to keep an eye on the poor and look after the poor is something that you could credit Lloyd George with.
Yeah, you remind me of that famous line from Dickens, A Christmas Carol.
All right,
a couple of gentlemen come to Scrooge and ask him for a donation for the poor, and his response is, "Oh, there are no prisons." Are there no workhouses?
Yes.
So Lloyd George transformed Western civilization, because virtually every Western culture today understands its obligation to help the poor and the elderly and the disabled, and to provide a compassionate and caring degree of support for them.
And obviously,
through
he's not
one
the
means
first
or
person to
another.
come up with the idea, but he was the first real person in power to bring it into legislation, to have that
Hmm.
budget go through. There were people during the Victorian age who were saying, yes, okay, we should look after, and there were lots of work being done by certain groups, particularly many religious groups. But this idea that the state can actually force rich people to give poor people some of their money, is quite a unique thing to do. In fact,
Another thing, another thing. You go ahead. Did you have another comment? Or?
People's budget. He actually called it a war budget. He said it is a war on poverty. So he made it sound like it. You know, this is a battle that we have to fight just as much as we have to fight foreign countries. We have to fight poverty within our country.
It's interesting that you say that, because that's the exact phrase that Lyndon Johnson had in the 1960s as he escalated our social programs to a higher level. He called them literally a war on poverty.
Yeah, well, there we are.
So he copied that phrase from Lloyd George. He truly was a man ahead of his time in many ways.
Very much so.
And another accomplishment, and we've already talked about this a little bit, and it destroyed his career, but hindsight being 2020, giving Ireland the independence that it deserved, giving the Irish people the democratic right to rule themselves, was the right thing and a good thing to do.
Absolutely.
So we have to look at that as an accomplishment today.
Yeah. And whereas the Ulster question didn't go away, it was him that identified, well, look, okay, if we let the 6 counties stay separate and stay part of the United Kingdom, then a lot of the problems that Ireland is facing will go away. And it certainly did help the situation, because, of course, it was those 6 counties that were the ones that were fighting to remain part of the United Kingdom. So I don't think it had ever got their agreement to join Ireland, certainly at the time, because the Protestant part of Northern Ireland were the ones with the money and with the power, and they were not going to give that up and join Dublin. So I think if he hadn't given that, you could say he should have made all of Ireland independent, but that wouldn't have worked, and he saw that wouldn't have worked. He saw what problems that those would have done. So it was a fudged together solution, but it was at least a solution that has sort of, I say there's still problems, but it's sort of worked between the two. So, yep.
Sure, and who knows, what the future holds. Part of it is in the hands of the people in the North, what they want to do with their own future. So
it is, and
the way democracy works.
Sinn Féin, I mean, the party that's in charge in Ireland is one that wants a united Ireland. So, I mean, it's down to birth rates. Quite simply, Catholics are better at having babies than Protestants are, and the population balance has gone above from 40 60 to 60-40. So it could well be that's going to be something to come into the future. Who knows?
Yes.
Yeah.
So can you offhand think of any other accomplishments? I mean, you're certainly have a greater depth of knowledge of his life. Are there any other things that we haven't mentioned today that were rather impressive accomplishments of Lloyd George in his political career?
I think we've talked about the main ones, and of course the suffragettes, that the votes for women did actually happen in his premiership. So he was, all right. Although I say it was a problem, he was the one that actually saw it through and made sure that women got the votes. So he could also claim that one, although it was felt that it was very much, he was driven to it rather than wanting it for himself. One story I would like to tell you that I think just tells you a lot about the man is I visited his grave a couple of months ago, and Prime Minister, great man, down in London. His gravestone, if ever you get the chance to go to it, is the most humble thing you can see. It's in the village he was brought up in Llanystumdwy, and it's simply a stone placed on top of where his body was buried, overlooking the river where he used to go for a walk as a child. So he's not buried in Westminster Abbey. He hasn't got a gigantic tomb. He hasn't got lots of things. It's a simple stone, and I think that tells you an awful lot about what this man was. He was a Welshman at heart, fought for Wales, but was very much he knew his place in the world and just tried to make it a better place.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's about as good as I can get as a homage I can pay to him, really.
Great. Well, it's a wonderful way to recap his entire life, Trevor. Well, thank you, Trevor, for your input today. Again, Trevor is the proprietor of Tudno Tours, and his contact information right now will be showing up in the video, and I encourage you to contact him next time you desire to go to that beautiful land of Cymru in the north and check it out. So we thank you, Trevor, for your input today. And for those of you that are watching the channel, if there are any other Welsh Americans or famous Welsh individuals that you would like to know more about, mention their names in the comments area below, and we'll see if we can get that information and a video out for you. Until next time, this is Greg Thomas thanking you for watching the Welsh American channel. Goodbye. Hwyl am nawr. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.